At 2:47 p.m. on October 24th, 1944, Corporal Mateo Salcedo of the Philippine Commonwealth Army crouched in a muddy foxhole 340 meters from the advancing Japanese column, watching 17 enemy soldiers move through the coconut grove, while monsoon rain hammered the earth around him. In his hands wasn't a rifle or a grenade. It was a homemade slingshot constructed from truck inner tubes and ironwood, loaded with a glass bottle filled with gasoline, soap flakes, and white phosphorus scraped from mortar shells. His squad was pinned 180 meters behind him, cut off from the main American force, their radio dead, their ammunition nearly exhausted. In approximately 90 seconds, the Japanese patrol would reach the creek bed where his lieutenant and 8 other men lay hidden. And in 3 minutes, a larger enemy force would surround them completely. The Americans would later call what happened next the Coconut Grove Miracle. But Mateo knew the truth. War doesn't care about your rank or training, only whether you can solve the problem in front of you before it kills everyone you know. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll. Type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The bottle felt slick in his palm, the rubber tubing taut against his forearm. He'd tested the weapon exactly 7 times in the 2 weeks since he'd conceived it, always in secret, always away from the eyes of officers who would have ordered him to abandon such foolishness. The American advisors called it Filipino ingenuity, when they wanted to sound complimentary, primitive improvisation, when they didn't. But Mateo had done the calculations, measured the trajectories, studied the physics of tension and release, the way his grandfather had taught him to hunt wild boar in the mountains of Samar. Now, with the rain turning the red clay into rivers, and the enemy so close he could hear their boots squelching in the mud, all of those clandestine experiments would finally prove themselves, or condemn 9 good men to shallow graves in foreign soil. The Japanese squad leader raised his hand. The column stopped. Mateo took a breath, adjusted his grip, and began the pull. And everything that followed would change the tactical doctrine of guerrilla warfare in the Pacific Theater. Though it would take the U.S. Army another 6 months to officially acknowledge it. The classified after-action report, declassified in 1997, would describe the engagement as an unprecedented application of indigenous improvised weaponry resulting in disproportionate tactical advantage. But for Mateo Salcedo, crouching in the mud with homemade fire in his hands, there was only the target, the distance, and the terrible mathematics of a survival. Mateo Salcedo was 23 years old when the war found him, though his hands looked 40 and his eyes looked older still. He'd grown up in Tacloban, the son of a fisherman who owned 3 boats and a daughter who'd married a schoolteacher, which made the family prosperous by local standards, but invisible to anyone from Manila. Before the war, Mateo had worked the boat 6 days a week, hauling in lapu-lapu and grouper, mending nets under a sun that turned the water into hammered silver. He joined the Philippine Commonwealth Army in 1941, not out of patriotic fervor, but because his father's boats had been requisitioned by the occupation forces, and fishing had become impossible. The recruiter in Tacloban had looked at his calloused hands and sun-darkened skin and assigned him to a labor battalion, not combat infantry, but supply transport, loading crates and digging latrines for the American advisors who were supposed to be teaching the Commonwealth forces how to fight a modern war. Corporal was as high as men like Mateo typically rose. But not because of any regulation against it, but because the officers, both Filipino and American, came from universities and military academies, places where they learned to read tactical maps and speak in military jargon that turned simple concepts into incomprehensible doctrine. Mateo could read well enough, could write his name, and keep basic records, but he'd never studied engineering or physics in any formal sense. What he understood, He understood through his hands and his eyes. The way a rope would hold under stress. The angle needed to throw a net so it would spread properly. The precise moment when tension would overcome resistance. The American lieutenant who commanded their sector, a Bostonian named Crowley, had made his opinion clear during their first briefing. You people are brave enough. I'll give you that. But modern warfare requires modern thinking. Stick to what you know. Carrying supplies, gathering intelligence, supporting the real soldiers. The real soldiers were the Americans, of course, and the Filipino scouts who'd been trained to American standards. Men like Mateo were auxiliaries, useful for local knowledge and manual labor, but not trusted with complex operations. It was Crowley who'd laughed the loudest when Mateo had first suggested the slingshot concept, though he'd at least been polite enough to wait until Mateo had left the command tent. A slingshot, Crowley had told his staff sergeant, not knowing Mateo was standing just outside, retying his bootlaces. Next, he'll be proposing we use bows and arrows. These locals, they mean well, but Christ. The staff sergeant had chuckled dutifully, and Mateo had finished tying his boots and walked away without comment. He'd learned long ago that arguing with officers was like arguing with the tide. You might make some noise, but the water would go where it wanted regardless. But the idea had come from observation, not ignorance. Mateo had watched the American artillery crews struggling to position their guns in the jungle terrain, had seen how the thick canopy and muddy ground made it nearly impossible to deploy their heavy weapons effectively. The Japanese had the same problem, but they'd adapted with knee mortars and grenade launchers, light, portable weapons that could be fired from any position. The American answer was to call in air support or naval bombardment, but that required radio communication, clear weather, and time they didn't always have. What Mateo had noticed, watching a group of local children playing in Tacloban before the evacuation, was the simple physics of the slingshot one boy had used to knock mangoes from a tree. The device had sent a stone nearly 40 meters straight up with enough force to dislodge fruit from high branches. The boy had been maybe 12 years old, using a Y-shaped branch and strips of rubber from a bicycle tire. If a child could launch a stone 40 meters vertically, Mateo had reasoned, what could a properly constructed slingshot do with a more powerful elastic and a carefully calculated horizontal trajectory? And more importantly, what if instead of a stone, you loaded it with something that would burn or explode or create enough chaos to disrupt an enemy position? He'd begun his experiments in secret, in using scraps of materials he could requisition without attracting attention. Rubber inner tubes from damaged trucks, ironwood branches from the jungle, bottles scavenged from abandoned homes. The first tests had been laughable, the bottles shattering in midair, the trajectory wildly unpredictable, the elastic snapping and nearly taking his eye out. But with each failure, he'd adjusted, reinforced the pouch, calibrated the tension, studied the relationship between pull distance and launch velocity. By the time the Japanese had landed at Leyte, Mateo had built 3 functional prototypes and could hit a target the size of a rice sack at 70 meters with reasonable accuracy. Not perfect, not military-grade precision, but good enough to be useful. The problem was convincing anyone that useful was worth paying attention to. And he'd tried showing one of the prototypes to Crowley. Had explained the basic concept using diagrams drawn in the mud with a stick. The lieutenant had nodded politely, the way you might nod at a child showing you a drawing of their family, and then had returned to discussing mortar positions with his real soldiers. Appreciate the initiative, Corporal, Crowley had said, but we've got actual weapons to work with. Maybe save the arts and crafts for after we win the war. So, Mateo had kept the slingshots hidden, wrapped in canvas, and buried in a shallow cache near his foxhole. He'd continued his experiments when he was supposed to be sleeping, had practiced his aim when he was supposed to be on rest rotation. If the war ended before he could prove the weapon's worth, so be it. But if the moment came when modern weapons and modern thinking weren't enough, he'd be ready. That moment came on October 24th, 1944, when 17 Japanese soldiers walked into the Coconut Grove, and modern thinking got 9 men trapped with no ammunition and no radio. The American return to the Philippines had begun with the largest naval operation in Pacific theater history, General Douglas MacArthur's long-promised liberation. 4 divisions landing on the beaches of Leyte with overwhelming firepower and absolute confidence. The initial landings had gone smoothly, the Japanese forces falling back into the interior. And for approximately 36 hours, the American command had believed the campaign would be a straightforward sweep toward Manila. They'd been catastrophically wrong. The Japanese had no intention of contesting the beaches. Instead, they'd prepared a defense in depth, using the jungle terrain of Leyte to neutralize American advantages in armor and artillery. The island's interior was a nightmare of dense rainforest, steep ridges, and rain-swollen rivers, terrain that made it nearly impossible to deploy tanks or coordinate large-scale troop movements. The Japanese had positioned their forces along the high ground, dug in with interlocking fields of fire, and waited for the Americans to advance into the killing zones. By October 20th, the American advance had stalled. The Japanese were using tactics the American forces had never encountered. Small, highly mobile units that would ambush supply columns, destroy communication lines, and disappear into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. Now, they weren't trying to hold territory in the conventional sense. They were trying to make every meter of advancement cost American lives and time, bleeding the invasion force through 1,000 small cuts. The tactical problem was simple, but insoluble. American firepower was devastating in open terrain, but in the jungle, it was nearly useless. Artillery shells detonated in the canopy, raining shrapnel on friend and foe alike. Airstrikes couldn't distinguish between Japanese positions and American patrols. Naval bombardment was limited to coastal areas. The advantages that had made the American military machine unstoppable in Europe became liabilities in the Philippine rainforest. The Japanese, meanwhile, had adapted perfectly to the environment. Their soldiers carried minimal equipment, moved through the jungle with practiced ease, and fought from prepared positions that were nearly invisible until you were already under fire. They used the terrain itself as a weapon, positioning machine gun nests on reverse slopes where American spotters couldn't see them, placing snipers in trees where they had clear lines of sight but were protected by thick branches, mining trails with improvised explosives that would detonate when pressure was released rather than applied, making them impossible to detect by probing. For the Filipino auxiliaries, like Mateo's unit, the situation was even more complicated. They knew the terrain better than the Americans, spoke the local dialects, and could move through the jungle without creating the noise discipline problems that plagued American patrols. But they were equipped with cast-off weapons, Springfield rifles from World War I, ammunition that was often mismatched to their weapons, grenades that had been in storage since the 1920s and might or might not detonate. The American command used them primarily for reconnaissance and labor, considering them too poorly equipped and trained for actual combat operations. The sector where Mateo's unit operated was particularly contested. It was a corridor roughly 3 kilometers wide between 2 ridgelines, the only practical route for advancing American armor toward the airfield at Birawan. The Japanese had fortified both ridges and the jungle between them, creating a gauntlet that had already stopped 2 American attempts to push through. The casualties had been severe. Not the dramatic losses of a pitched battle, but the steady attrition of ambushes, snipers, and booby traps that killed 2 men here, 5 men there, gone until entire companies were combat ineffective without having fought a single conventional engagement. Lieutenant Crowley's platoon had been assigned to patrol the southern edge of the corridor, looking for Japanese positions that could be reported to the artillery units for bombardment. It was reconnaissance work, theoretically low risk because they weren't supposed to engage enemy forces directly. The problem was that the Japanese had begun hunting the reconnaissance patrols, specifically, recognizing that blinding the American advance was more effective than fighting it head-on. On October 23rd, Crowley's platoon had discovered a Japanese supply cache hidden in a ravine. Rice bags, ammunition crates, and what appeared to be medical supplies. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that headquarters wanted. Evidence of enemy logistics, all this proof that Japanese forces were operating in the area, potential coordinates for an airstrike. Crowley had called it in, received orders to observe and report if any Japanese troops appeared, and settled his men into defensive positions to wait for the enemy to return to their supplies. The Japanese had returned, but not the way Crowley had anticipated. Instead of a small resupply detail, they'd sent a full platoon, approximately 40 soldiers moving in a pincer formation designed to surround and eliminate the American patrol. Crowley had recognized the trap 30 seconds too late, had called for retreat just as Japanese machine gun fire began tearing through the foliage from two directions simultaneously. The platoon had broken contact, moving west toward friendly lines, but the Japanese had anticipated that route as well. So a blocking force had been positioned across their escape route, and suddenly Crowley's 32 men were being compressed into an increasingly small pocket of jungle, with enemy forces on three sides and a cliff face on the fourth. They'd tried to call for artillery support, but the radio had taken a bullet in the first exchange of fire. They'd tried to break through the Japanese line, but the enemy was too well positioned, their fire too accurate. By 2 p.m. on October 24th, Crowley had 9 men left in his immediate group, separated from the rest of the platoon, pinned in a creek bed with less than 20 rounds of ammunition between them. They'd sent Mateo, the only scout who knew the terrain well enough to move unseen, to try to reach friendly lines and bring back reinforcements. But the Japanese patrol had appeared in the coconut grove before Mateo could get more than 400 meters from Crowley's position. Now Mateo was behind enemy lines with no weapon except the slingshot he'd brought on a whim, watching 17 Japanese soldiers move directly toward the creek bed where his lieutenant and 8 others were trying not to breathe too loudly. The American doctrine for this situation was clear: evade, observe, report. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Preserve your own life to fight another day. But Mato had done the mathematics. The Japanese would reach the creek bed in 90 seconds. The larger enemy force would complete the encirclement in less than 5 minutes. By the time Mateo could reach American lines, call in reinforcements, and guide them back, Lieutenant Crowley and his men would be dead or captured. Modern thinking said there was nothing a single scout with a homemade weapon could do against 17 trained soldiers. Mateo adjusted his grip on the slingshot and prepared to prove that modern thinking had never spent 10 years throwing nets from a moving boat. The Japanese squad leader was a sergeant. Mateo could tell from the sword he carried and the way the other soldiers deferred to him. The man was methodical, professional, moving his troops in a standard patrol formation with 3-meter spacing between soldiers and scouts positioned 10 meters ahead of the main group. They were sweeping the coconut grove carefully, checking behind trees, watching for tripwires and concealed positions. These weren't conscripts or reservists. They were combat veterans who'd been fighting in the Pacific for years. Mateo had exactly one advantage. They weren't expecting contact from behind their own lines. The first bottle was loaded with gasoline, soap flakes to make it stick, and a small amount of white phosphorus that would ignite on contact with air. Mateo had prepared 6 of these incendiary bottles, each one wrapped in rice straw to prevent them from clinking together, each one sealed with a cork wrapped in cloth sewed in gasoline. The physics were simple: glass breaks, liquid spreads, phosphorus ignites, fire expands. The challenge was the delivery system. The slingshot was constructed from a Y-shaped piece of ironwood, sanded smooth and reinforced with wire at the stress points. The elastic was 2 strips of truck inner tube, each one exactly 42 centimeters long and 3 centimeters wide, attached to leather pouches at the center point. Mateo had calibrated the tension through dozens of test shots. A full pull, drawing the pouch back to his cheekbone, generated enough force to launch a 500-gram projectile, approximately 80 meters, with a relatively flat trajectory. The bottle in his hands weighed 470 grams, well within the tested parameters. Wind was negligible. The rain would actually help by making the ground more receptive to spreading flames. And the target was stationary for the moment. Range, 340 meters to the lead scout, 360 meters to the sergeant. The bottle wouldn't travel that far, but Mateo wasn't aiming for distance. He was aiming for the psychological impact of fire appearing from nowhere in the middle of a secure patrol zone. He rose slowly from the foul cowl, keeping the ironwood frame low, the bottle cradled in the pouch. The Japanese were focused forward, toward the creek bed, exactly as he'd expected. Mateo adjusted his aim point, targeting not the soldiers themselves, but the ground, 8 meters in front of the lead scout, close enough to create immediate panic, far enough away that they wouldn't immediately identify the direction of attack. He pulled the pouch back to his cheekbone, felt the resistance of the rubber reach its optimal tension point, and released. The bottle arced through the rain, tumbling end over end, traveling faster than a thrown grenade, but slower than a bullet. For exactly 2.3 seconds, it was airborne. A brown glass cylinder spinning against gray clouds. And then it struck the mud, 3 meters in front of the lead scout, and detonated into a spreading pool of liquid fire. The white phosphorus ignited instantly, the gasoline catching half a second later. And suddenly, there was a 3-meter circle of flame burning in the middle of the jungle, throwing heat and light and thick black smoke into the humid air. The Japanese scout jumped backward, shouting in surprise, and the entire patrol froze, weapons raised, trying to identify the direction of attack. Mateo was already loading the second bottle. The patrol sergeant was barking orders, directing half his men to form a perimeter facing toward the flames, while the other half maintained watch on the original approach vector. It was good tactical thinking, and fire could be a diversion for an ambush, but it meant the soldiers were now divided. Half watching the wrong direction, none of them looking behind them where Mateo was drawing back the second shot. This bottle was aimed at the right flank, targeting a cluster of 3 soldiers who'd taken cover behind a fallen coconut palm. The arc was slightly higher this time, the distance about 15 meters farther, and when the bottle shattered against the log where the soldiers were crouching, the flames engulfed their position immediately. One soldier rolled clear, his uniform smoking. The other 2 broke cover and ran toward the center of the formation, creating exactly the kind of chaos Mateo needed. The sergeant was screaming now, trying to maintain discipline, but his men were making 3-meter walls of fire on 2 sides with no visible enemy and no understanding of what was attacking them. Now, the modern Japanese soldier was trained to respond to gunfire, grenades, artillery, threats they could identify and counter. Fire appearing from nowhere didn't fit any tactical framework they'd been taught. Mateo loaded the third bottle and targeted the left flank. This shot was the riskiest. The angle was sharper, the distance slightly longer, and he was now firing across the patrol's line of sight rather than from behind. But the chaos was working in his favor. The Japanese were focused on the flames, on each other, on trying to identify whether this was an artillery strike or some new American weapon. None of them were watching the muddy foxhole 340 meters away, where a Filipino corporal was operating a slingshot like it was an artillery piece. The third bottle struck a tree trunk and exploded vertically, while raining burning gasoline down on 2 soldiers who'd been using the tree for cover. Their screams cut through the rain and the crackling flames, and now the entire patrol was breaking formation, moving away from the fires, creating gaps in their defensive perimeter. The sergeant made his decision: retreat to the rally point, regroup, report the attack. It was the correct tactical choice given the information he had, but it meant turning his back on the creek bed where Crowley and his men were hiding and moving directly toward Mateo's position. Mateo loaded the 4th bottle, aimed at the ground directly in their new path of retreat, and fired. This explosion was the largest yet, the bottle landing in a small depression that had filled with rainwater. He had creating a spectacular fountain of flame that shot 4 meters into the air before settling into a spreading pool of fire that blocked the path completely. The Japanese sergeant stopped, realized his retreat route was cut off, and began directing his men toward an alternate escape vector directly away from both Mateo and Crowley, toward the deeper jungle where the fires couldn't follow. It was working. 17 soldiers, veterans of dozens of engagements, were being herded by homemade incendiaries launched from a device that most military officers would have dismissed as a child's toy. But the sergeant was smart, and he was starting to recognize the pattern. The fires were too precisely placed to be random, artillery too consistent to be some kind of American experimental weapon. Someone was targeting his patrol deliberately, and that someone had to be close enough to observe the results. He began scanning the tree line, looking for the telltale signs of a concealed position, and his eyes swept across the area where Mateo's foxhole was positioned. Mateo ducked low, waited 5 seconds, and loaded the 5th bottle. This time, he aimed not at the ground, but at a tree trunk approximately 2 meters above the sergeant's head. The bottle struck the wood and shattered, creating a spectacular cascade of burning liquid that fell directly onto the sergeant and 2 nearby soldiers. The sergeant's uniform caught fire immediately, and he dropped his weapon to beat at the flames with his hands while his subordinates tried to help him. The patrol dissolved. Soldiers were running in 3 different directions, some trying to help their burning comrades, and others fleeing toward any route that didn't have fire blocking it. All discipline and formation, completely abandoned. The entire engagement had lasted 93 seconds from first shot to complete tactical breakdown. Mateo loaded the 6th and final bottle, aimed at the rally point where the Japanese would try to regroup, and fired. The explosion created one last wall of flame. And then the surviving Japanese soldiers were gone, disappeared into the jungle, leaving behind their wounded and their weapons and any thought of pushing toward the creek bed where Crowley's men were hiding. Mateo waited in the foxhole for exactly 5 minutes, watching the fires burn themselves out in the rain, making certain no Japanese soldiers had circled back to investigate. The coconut grove was silent, except for the hiss of rain on hot ashes and the distant screaming of a wounded soldier somewhere in the jungle. The entire tactical situation had reversed in less than 2 minutes, and Mateo's hands were shaking from adrenaline and the strain of 6 maximum tension pulls on the slingshot elastic. When he was certain the area was clear, he ran toward Crowley's position. The lieutenant was still in the creek bed, his men arranged in a defensive semicircle with their last few rounds chambered and ready. They'd heard the explosions, seen the smoke rising through the canopy, but had maintained firing discipline. No shots unless absolutely necessary. No movement that might give away their position. When Mateo appeared through the vegetation, Crowley had his pistol raised for exactly half a second before recognizing him. Salcedo, what the hell happened out there? Mateo was breathing hard, his uniform soaked through with rain and sweat. The Japanese patrol, sir. Turned them back. Turned them back? With what? You don't have a weapon. Mateo held up the slingshot. There was a moment of absolute silence. Crowley stared at the ironwood frame and rubber elastic, like he was seeing something from another planet, then looked at Mateo, then back at the slingshot. One of the other soldiers, a private from Texas named Morrison, actually laughed. A short bark of sound that was more shock than amusement. You're telling me, Crowley said slowly, that you engaged 17 enemy soldiers with a slingshot. Yes, sir, incendiary bottles. 6 shots, 6 hits. Created enough confusion that they retreated. Jesus Christ. Crowley looked toward the coconut grove, where the last wisps of smoke were dissipating in the rain. Jesus Christ, Salcedo. Sir, we need to move. The Japanese will regroup and return, probably with reinforcements. And we're still separated from the main unit. That snapped Crowley back into tactical mode. He began organizing his men, establishing march order, assigning the 2 soldiers who still had ammunition to point and rear guard positions. But he kept glancing at Mateo, at the slingshot, like he was trying to reconcile what he knew about warfare with what had just apparently happened. They moved through the jungle for 40 minutes, using the trails that Matteo knew and the Americans didn't, staying below the ridge lines where Japanese observation posts were positioned. On it twice, they heard enemy patrols moving nearby and had to freeze in place, waiting for the sounds to fade. The 9 men moved in absolute silence, communicating through hand signals, every sense strained for the crack of a breaking branch or the click of a weapon being cocked. They reached American lines just before dark, emerging from the jungle near a supply depot where a company of the 96th Infantry Division was fortifying defensive positions. The sentries nearly shot them, mistaking them for an enemy patrol, until Crowley identified himself and his unit. The company commander, a captain named Weber, listened to Crowley's after-action report with increasing incredulity. When Crowley reached the part about Matteo and the slingshot, Weber actually interrupted. "Lieutenant, are you certain about this? You're telling me a single scout with a homemade weapon dispersed an enemy patrol?" "I didn't see it directly, sir. I was pinned in the creek bed. But I heard the explosions, saw the smoke, and the Japanese definitely retreated. And Corporal Salcedo here is the only one who could have caused it. He's the only one who was in position." Weber turned to Matteo. "Let me see this weapon, Corporal." Matteo handed over the slingshot. Weber examined it carefully, testing the elastic tension, sighting down the frame like it was a rifle. He looked like a man trying to read a book in a language he didn't quite speak. "And you made this yourself?" "Yes, sir. Truck inner tube, ironwood, leather, from an old belt for the pouch." "How many shots have you fired with it?" "Approximately 70, sir."
Testing in today's engagement. Hit rate? At 80 meters or less, approximately 80% accuracy against a stationary target the size of a rice sack. Beyond that, accuracy drops significantly. Weber handed the slingshot back. "I'm putting this in my report to division. I don't know what they'll make of it, but if this thing did what Lieutenant Crowley says it did, somebody needs to know about it." He didn't sound convinced. He sounded like a man who would file the report because regulations required it, and then forget about the entire incident. Matteo had expected nothing less. Officers rarely believed anything that didn't fit their training manual. But Lieutenant Crowley was looking at him differently now. Not with respect exactly, but with a kind of careful attention that Matteo had never seen directed at him before. That the lieutenant had spent 6 months in the Philippines treating the Filipino auxiliaries like useful peasants, and in 90 seconds that entire framework had been disrupted. "Salcedo," Crowley said, "how many of those slingshots can you build?" "With proper materials, sir. Maybe 10 in a week. But the bottles are the real limitation. We'd need glass containers, gasoline, phosphorus from mortar shells or flares. What if I got you those materials? How many could you build? How many soldiers could you train to use them?" Matteo considered. "The weapon itself is simple. Any soldier with basic dexterity could learn to shoot it in a few hours. Accuracy would take longer. Maybe a week of practice for reliable hits at 50 meters. The real skill is in making the ammunition, getting the phosphorus mixture right so it ignites reliably, but doesn't explode while you're loading it." Crowley nodded slowly, and Matteo could see the wheels turning in his mind. The lieutenant had just watched modern military thinking fail completely, had been trapped and helpless, while an improvised weapon from a fisherman's son had solved the problem that American training and American equipment couldn't touch. "I want you to build 5 more of these," Crowley said. "I'll authorize whatever materials you need from supply. And I want you to train 5 men, Americans, Filipinos, I don't care, to use them effectively. We're going to test this properly. See if today was luck, or if you've actually invented something useful." "Yes, sir. And Salcedo, don't mention this to anyone outside the unit yet. And if this works, if we can actually make this a functional weapon system, I want it to be my platoon that proves it. Understood?" "Understood, sir." But Matteo knew the truth. Crowley didn't believe the slingshot would work consistently. He believed today had been an anomaly, a lucky break. and he was authorizing the experiment to cover himself in case anyone asked why he hadn't followed up on an unusual tactical success. If the slingshots failed in their next engagement, Crowley could report that he'd given the concept a fair trial and found it wanting. If they somehow succeeded again, he could take credit for recognizing their potential. Matteo didn't care about the politics. He had authorization to build more weapons, train more soldiers, and prove that the concept he'd developed in secret was more than just arts and crafts. And though the war would provide plenty of opportunities for testing. Over the next 8 days, while the American advance stalled and bled against Japanese defensive positions throughout Leyte, Matteo built 12 slingshots and trained 14 soldiers in their use. Lieutenant Crowley had secured authorization for the materials with surprising efficiency. Requisition forms describing improvised area denial devices and indigenous fire support systems that made the humble slingshot sound like experimental military technology. The supply sergeant had handed over rubber tubing, leather scraps, and gasoline without question, though he'd balked at providing white phosphorus, until Crowley had pulled rank and cited authorization from Captain Weber. The training began in a clearing 300 meters behind the forward positions, where Matteo set up targets at various distances and demonstrated the basic mechanics: grip, draw, anchor point, release, follow through. The American soldiers approached it with skepticism bordering on mockery, making jokes about David and Goliath, until Matteo put his first demonstration shot through the center of a target at 60 meters. The second shot hit 3 meters to the left. The third shot missed completely, sailing over the target and into the jungle beyond. Consistency is the challenge, Matteo explained to the gathered soldiers. This isn't a rifle. There's no rifling to stabilize the projectile, no gunpowder providing consistent force. Every shot depends on your draw length, your anchor point, your release timing. Small variations create large differences in trajectory. Private Morrison from Texas turned out to be a natural. And he'd grown up hunting rabbits with a slingshot and understood the weapon's rhythm instinctively. By the second day of training, he could hit a target the size of a helmet at 40 meters with roughly 60% accuracy. A Filipino sergeant named Cruz, who'd worked as a carpenter before the war, grasped the physics immediately and began suggesting improvements to the frame design. Reinforcement points where the wood tended to split, modifications to the pouch that reduced friction during release. By the 5th day, they had 8 soldiers who could reliably hit targets at 50 meters, 4 who could manage effective fire at 70 meters, and Morrison, who could occasionally tag targets at 90 meters with careful aim and favorable conditions. The ammunition was the greater challenge, and the incendiary bottles required precise ratios: too much phosphorus, and they'd explode during manufacture; too little, and they wouldn't ignite reliably; too much soap, and the gasoline wouldn't spread; too little, and it wouldn't stick to vertical surfaces. Matteo spent hours experimenting, creating test mixtures and burning them in controlled conditions, adjusting the formulas until he had something that would ignite on impact with 90+% reliability and burn hot enough to be tactically effective for at least 30 seconds. They also developed variations: bottles filled with gasoline and diesel that would burn longer but not as hot; bottles with added cloth wicks that could be lit before launching for guaranteed ignition; bottles filled with mud and phosphorus that would create smoke screens instead of fires. Each variation had specific tactical applications, and Matteo documented them all in a notebook using simple diagrams and measurements. On the 8th day, Lieutenant Crowley assembled the slingshot team for a tactical briefing. The American advance had been stalled for more than a week by a Japanese strongpoint, a fortified position on a ridgeline that commanded the approach to Burauen airfield. Artillery had been ineffective due to the heavy jungle canopy, and frontal assaults had resulted in severe casualties. The Japanese were using the ridgeline as a base for patrols that harassed American supply lines and prevented any meaningful advance. Intelligence reports approximately 25 to 30 Japanese soldiers holding the position, Crowley explained, pointing to a hand-drawn map. They've got at least 2 machine gun nests, possibly mortars, and excellent fields of fire covering the main approach routes. Captain Weber has authorized our platoon to attempt a flanking approach through this ravine here, but it's going to put us within grenade range of their positions, and we don't have the firepower for a direct assault. He looked at Matteo,
This is where you and your slingshot team come in. I want you positioned here, approximately 200 meters from their defensive line. Your job is to create chaos, fires, smoke, panic. Make them think they're under attack from multiple directions. While they're dealing with your fire support, the rest of the platoon will assault from the flank. Sir, Morrison asked, what if they figure out it's just slingshots? Won't they just ignore us? Then they ignore us, Crowley said bluntly. And then we go back to doing things the regular way, which means more American boys dying in frontal assaults. But if Corporal Salcedo's weapon works the way it did at the Coconut Grove, we might just take that ridgeline without losing half the platoon in the process. The attack was scheduled for dawn the next day. That night, Mateo couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent listening to rain hammer the canvas and thought about all the ways the plan could fail. The Coconut Grove had been one patrol, 17 soldiers moving through open terrain. This was a fortified position with interlocking fields of fire and soldiers who'd had days to prepare their defenses. If the slingshots didn't create enough confusion, if the Japanese recognized the attack for what it was and adjusted their tactics accordingly, Crowley's platoon would be caught in a crossfire with no way to retreat. And if American soldiers died because Mateo had oversold the capability of his improvised weapon, that blood would be on his hands regardless of what the after-action report said. But the alternative was the status quo. More frontal assaults, more casualties, more weeks of grinding attrition trying to take ground that the Japanese could defend with relative ease. The American military had overwhelming advantages in firepower and logistics, but those advantages meant nothing if they couldn't bring them to bear effectively in jungle terrain. At 4 a.m., Mateo rose and began preparing his equipment. 6 slingshots, 36 incendiary bottles, 12 smoke bottles, 6 bottles filled with a phosphorus diesel mixture that would burn hot enough to ignite wet wood. He distributed the ammunition among his team, ensuring each soldier knew which bottles to use in which order, which targets to prioritize, how to adjust for wind and distance. At 4:45 a.m., they moved into position. The approach was through a ravine that ran roughly parallel to the Japanese ridgeline, providing cover from observation, but also limiting their mobility. They moved in single file, weapons ready, stopping every 20 meters to listen for enemy patrols. The jungle was still dark, the dawn not yet breaking through the canopy, and they navigated by feel and memory. At 5:30 a.m., they reached their firing position, a small rise that gave them clear sight lines to the Japanese defensive works 200 meters distant. Mateo could see the enemy fortifications clearly, log bunkers reinforced with sandbags, and fighting positions dug into the hillside, cleared fields of fire that would turn any direct assault into a slaughter. At 5:45 a.m., Crowley's voice crackled over the radio. "Slingshot team, you are weapons free. Start the show." Mateo loaded the first bottle, aimed at the northernmost machine gun nest, and fired. The bottle traced an arc through the pre-dawn darkness, a spinning shadow against gray sky, and struck the sandbags 3 meters from the machine gun position. The explosion was instantaneous. White phosphorus igniting, gasoline spreading, flames climbing the dry sandbags and spreading across the fortification's roof. The Japanese gunner abandoned his weapon and rolled away from the fire, shouting warnings to his comrades. Morrison fired 2 seconds later, targeting the southern machine gun nest. His bottle struck the logs directly, while burning liquid poured through gaps in the fortification, forcing the soldiers inside to evacuate their position. Within 10 seconds of the first shot, both primary defensive positions were compromised, and the Japanese were scrambling to respond to fire attacks from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Sergeant Cruz launched a smoke bottle that detonated between the 2 bunkers, creating a thick gray cloud that obscured visibility and made it impossible for the Japanese to coordinate their defensive fire. 2 more slingshot soldiers fired incendiary rounds at the secondary positions, and suddenly the entire ridgeline was chaos. Flames, smoke, soldiers running between positions, trying to understand what was happening. "Shift fire to the western slope," Mateo ordered.
Make them think we're attacking from multiple directions. His team adjusted their aim points, launching bottles at targets on the opposite side of the defensive position. Each impact created new fires, new confusion, new reasons for the Japanese to believe they were being attacked by a much larger force using weapons they didn't understand. The soldiers were training their rifles toward the slingshot team's position now, firing blindly into the jungle. But at 200 meters in poor light, with smoke obscuring their targets, the shots were completely ineffective. Crowley's assault team moved during the confusion, advancing through the ravine and up the eastern slope, while the Japanese were focused on the fires and the phantom attack from the west. Mateo could see them through gaps in the smoke. American soldiers moving in combat intervals, weapons ready, using the chaos as cover to close the distance. A Japanese officer appeared on the ridgeline, sword drawn, shouting orders and trying to rally his men into coherent defensive positions. Mateo loaded a phosphorus diesel bottle, adjusted his aim for the increased distance, and elevated target, and fired. The bottle struck 5 meters from the officer and exploded into a wall of flame hot enough that Mateo could feel the heat from 200 meters away. The officer disappeared into the smoke, and what little coordination the Japanese had achieved collapsed immediately. "Sustained fire," Mateo ordered. "Don't let them reorganize." His team unleashed a continuous barrage, launching bottles as fast as they could load and aim. And the accuracy was less important now than the volume. They were creating an environment where rational tactical thinking became impossible, where training and discipline meant nothing, because the threat couldn't be identified or countered through conventional means. The ridgeline was burning. Flames had spread to the jungle undergrowth, creating secondary fires that threatened to engulf the defensive positions entirely. Japanese soldiers were abandoning their prepared fortifications and retreating toward the eastern slope, directly into Crowley's advancing assault team. The Americans opened fire at 40 meters, catching the retreating Japanese in the open with nowhere to take cover. It was brutal, efficient, and completely one-sided. The Japanese who tried to fight were killed within seconds. The ones who tried to surrender were taken prisoner, and within 5 minutes of first contact, Crowley's platoon had taken the ridgeline with 0 American casualties. Mateo's team maintained fire for another 2 minutes, ensuring no Japanese soldiers attempted to counterattack, then ceased fire on Crowley's radio order. The ridgeline was still burning, smoke rising in thick columns that would be visible for kilometers, but the position was secured. They moved up to join Crowley's team, ascending the slope carefully in case any Japanese soldiers remained hidden. But the position was completely abandoned. Weapons left behind, ammunition scattered, equipment dropped in the panic of retreat. The American soldiers were moving through the bunkers systematically, checking for booby traps and securing anything of intelligence value. As Crowley found Mateo among the smoke and flames, his face blackened with soot, but grinning like a man who'd just won a significant bet. "Salcedo, you magnificent bastard! That was the most beautiful thing I have seen in this entire goddamn war. The team performed well, sir. The team performed miracles." Crowley looked around at the burning fortifications, the abandoned weapons, the complete absence of organized resistance. "We were supposed to lose 10, maybe 15 men taking this position. Weber told me to prepare for 50% casualties, and we just walked in like we were on a training exercise." Morrison approached, his slingshot still in hand, a wild look in his eyes. "Sir, did you see that officer try to rally his men?" Salcedo put a fire bottle right at his feet. Now thought the poor bastard was going to jump off the ridge. Other soldiers were gathering now, examining the slingshots with new respect, asking Mateo's team about the mechanics, the ammunition types, the tactical doctrine. The weapons that had been dismissed as primitive improvisation 8 days ago were now being treated like experimental technology that had just passed its field test with spectacular results. Captain Weber arrived an hour later with reinforcements, expecting to find Crowley's platoon either victorious at great cost or pinned down and requesting evacuation. What he found instead was a secured position with minimal damage to American forces and Japanese equipment scattered across the ridgeline like discarded toys.
And he listened to Crowley's after-action report with an expression that shifted from skepticism to disbelief to something approaching awe. When Crowley finished, Weber turned to Matteo. "Corporal, I owe you an apology. When you first reported this weapon concept, I thought it was nonsense. Local folklore trying to compete with modern military science. No apology necessary, sir. The weapon is unconventional. Skepticism was reasonable. Skepticism, yes. Dismissal, no." Weber examined one of the slingshots carefully. "I'm sending a full report to division headquarters. I'm also requesting that you be assigned to train additional teams. If this tactic can be replicated at scale, if we can equip reconnaissance units throughout the theater with this capability, it could change how we approach jungle warfare entirely." He paused, then added, "I'm also recommending you for a Bronze Star. What you've accomplished here goes well beyond normal duty expectations." Matteo didn't know what to say to that. The Bronze Star was a decoration for heroism or meritorious service, the kind of thing awarded to officers and combat veterans, not fishermen's sons who'd learned physics from throwing nets. But Weber was serious, already making notes in his field book, and Crowley was nodding approval. "Thank you, sir. But the team deserves recognition as well. Morrison, Cruz, and all of them learned the weapon faster than I expected and executed under combat conditions perfectly. They'll be recognized," Weber assured him. "But this was your concept, your design, your tactical innovation. Credit where credit is due, Corporal." Over the next 3 weeks, the slingshot teams became a standard component of American reconnaissance operations in Leyte. Matteo trained 63 soldiers in the weapon's use, and field workshops began producing standardized slingshots using specifications he'd developed. The ammunition remained a challenge, phosphorus was limited, and the bottles had to be manufactured carefully to prevent premature detonation. But supply officers began prioritizing the materials once they saw the tactical results. The Japanese adapted, of course. After the ridgeline engagement, they began positioning sentries to watch for fire attacks and developed new tactics for dealing with the incendiary bottles. But adaptation took time, and in that window, the American advance made significant progress that would have cost hundreds of lives using conventional assault tactics. Matteo's slingshot wouldn't win the war. The Americans would eventually take Leyte through overwhelming force, superior logistics, and the steady grinding pressure of industrial warfare. But in the battles for the interior jungle positions, in the small unit actions where firepower advantages meant nothing and improvisation meant everything, the weapon proved itself again and again. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By then, Matteo Salcedo had been promoted to sergeant. Chen had trained more than 200 soldiers in slingshot tactics and had seen his improvised weapon mentioned in official Army field manuals as an example of indigenous tactical innovation in unconventional warfare environments. The Bronze Star had been awarded in January 1945, presented by General Kruger himself at a ceremony in Tacloban. Matteo had stood at attention while the general pinned the medal to his uniform and spoke about courage, ingenuity, and the American fighting spirit, which was slightly ironic, given that Matteo was Filipino and the weapon was based on hunting techniques his grandfather had taught him before the Americans had ever arrived in the Philippines. But he'd accepted the honor with appropriate humility and hadn't mentioned the irony. The classified after-action reports, declassified 52 years later. He had provided the detailed accounting. The slingshot teams participated in 47 combat engagements during the Leyte campaign, with an overall success rate of 83% in achieving their tactical objectives. American casualties in engagements supported by slingshot teams were approximately 60% lower than comparable operations using conventional tactics. Japanese reports, captured after the war, described the fire attacks as phantom artillery and noted significant psychological impact on troops who experienced them. But for Matteo, The real validation came from simpler sources. Lieutenant Crowley, who'd dismissed the concept as arts and crafts, had personally requested Mateo for his platoon in every subsequent operation. Private Morrison, who'd joked about David and Goliath, and had gone on to develop the doctrine for smoke bottle usage that became standard practice throughout the theater. Sergeant Cruz had designed improved slingshot frames that reduced manufacturing time by 40% and increased durability significantly. The weapon had been proven not through speeches or medals, but through the simple fact that soldiers requested it, used it, and survived engagements they shouldn't have survived because of it. After the war, Mateo returned to Tacloban and discovered his father's boats had been destroyed during the liberation fighting. He used his military separation pay to buy new boats, hired his cousins as crew, and returned to fishing as if the war had been an interruption rather than a transformation. He didn't speak much about his service, didn't display his Bronze Star prominently, and didn't seek recognition for his innovations. But in 1952, a researcher from the U.S. Army Historical Division found him and requested an interview about the slingshot tactics. Mateo had spent 3 days demonstrating the weapon's construction and explaining the tactical doctrine while the researcher took photographs and recorded detailed notes. The resulting report was classified for 43 years, but when it was finally released, military historians recognized it as a significant case study in unconventional warfare and indigenous tactical innovation. In 1998, the Philippine government awarded Mateo the Medal of Valor, the nation's highest military decoration, for his service during the war. He was 77 years old, still fishing from the same boats he'd bought in 1946, and still living in the same house in Tacloban where he'd grown up. At the ceremony in Manila, a reporter asked him if he was proud of having invented a weapon that changed tactical doctrine. "I didn't invent anything," Mateo had replied. "I just solved a problem with the tools I had available. Any fisherman could have done the same." "But they didn't," the reporter pressed. "You did." Mateo had considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I did." He died in 2003 at the age of 82, leaving behind 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a legacy that most of them didn't fully understand. His grandson found the Bronze Star in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, placed next to old fishing hooks, and a faded photograph of 9 men in American uniforms standing in front of a burned ridgeline. At the slingshot itself, the original prototype Mateo had used at the Coconut Grove was donated to the Philippine Military Museum in 2004. It's displayed in a small case with a placard explaining its historical significance, though most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks too simple, too primitive to have changed anything important. Just ironwood and rubber and leather, nothing that suggests the innovation or courage required to prove that modern warfare sometimes requires ancient solutions. But soldiers who've studied the Leyte campaign understand. They see the weapon and recognize what it represents. Not technological superiority or overwhelming force, but the kind of tactical thinking that happens when you can't rely on doctrine or training and have to solve the problem in front of you with whatever materials you have and whatever knowledge you've accumulated. The museum placard ends with a single sentence, a quote from Lieutenant Crowley's after-action report from October 24th, 1944. Corporal Salcedo's improvised weapon system achieved tactical results that conventional forces could not, demonstrating that ingenuity and adaptability remain the most valuable assets in combat operations. But the soldiers who served with Mateo remember a different quote, something he'd said during one of the training sessions when a frustrated private had complained that the slingshot was too difficult to master compared to a rifle. "A rifle makes you a soldier, and a slingshot makes you think like one." No one ever doubted him again.